The walls were decorated with a few framed pictures, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. First, the apartment seemed perfectly fine. Nothing extraordinary, nothing to be concerned about. But as they settled in, Chandra couldn't help but feel a subtle shift in the air. There was something in the way Tariq avoided her gaze when she asked about the apartment's location. The way he danced around the details of why they couldn't stay somewhere more traditional. The questions were simple, but his responses felt hurried, like he was trying to mask something. They sat together on the couch, chatting about the things that had been left unsaid in their months of online conversations. They talked about their hopes for the future, their shared faith, their mutual love of books and art. It was easy, comforting even to talk to him in person. The connection they had forged through messages and video calls was stronger now, but there was still something about him, something just a bit off. She couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't long before the silence between them became thick with anticipation. After hours of talking, Chandra finally felt the tension of the day melt away. 8 hours after landing in a small apartment that should have been filled with excitement, Sandra found herself confronting a horrifying truth. What she discovered about Tariq that night, what she saw in a moment of raw terror, would lead to a brutal act that no one could foresee. Welcome to Let's Story Crime Department. Thanks for your support. Stay tuned for gripping true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe. She leaned in slowly, cautiously, a subtle invitation. She wanted to take the next step, to feel the closeness they had discussed so many times before. As Tariq moved to undress, she saw something she could never have expected, something that shattered the image she had built in her mind. His body, once seen only through the words he had carefully chosen, now revealed a disturbing truth. His genital area was severely infected, raw, and oozing with visible sores. But that wasn't the worst part. There, crawling over the wounds, maggots, tiny writhing larvae moving in the open sores, their presence unmistakable. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. The foul smell hit her immediately. A stench so overwhelming it made her stomach churn. It was a combination of decay, rot, and something else. Something deeply unsettling. She recoiled instinctively, her hand flying to her mouth to block out the smell, but it was impossible to ignore. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. This was no accident. This was something far worse. She stepped back quickly, her eyes wide with disbelief. She couldn't understand what she was seeing. How could this be real? How could a man who had promised her everything, respect, love, patience, hide something so dark, so disturbing? Tariq seemed to sense her shock. His face twisted into something that was not quite remorse, not quite shame, but a mixture of both. He stammered, struggling to find the words, his voice shaking as he tried to explain. He told her it was a past he had tried to bury, a compulsion that had taken root during his time working in mortuary transportation. He spoke of it as if it were a sickness, something that had plagued him for years. He said he had repented, tried to rid himself of it, but the damage was done. The sores had developed in recent days, just before she arrived, a consequence of his past. He had hoped that love, the love they shared, could heal what shame could not. Sandra stood there frozen. The man she had come to meet, the one she had trusted with her heart, was not the man she had imagined. The reality of who he was hit her like a wave, overwhelming her, drowning her in disbelief. She had come so far, physically, emotionally, and yet in this moment she realized she had no idea who he truly was. Her voice was calm, surprisingly so. "You lied to me," she said, her words sharp but steady. "I came across the world for a man of God. But you're not that. You're sick and I'm going to report you. People need to know." Those were the last words she spoke before everything shattered, before Tariq's actions took a dark turn. What happened in those next few moments would forever change the course of her life and his. Her body trembled, but not from fear of him. Not yet. It was the shock of realization, the devastation that her intuition, her heart, had been wrong. She had fallen for a version of him that he had crafted, a version that was carefully curated with words and promises, but never once grounded in reality. The man standing before her now was someone else entirely, someone broken, someone dangerous, someone she never should have trusted. She took a step back, her voice calm but cutting. "You lied to me," she repeated, her eyes locking with his. "You're not the man you said you were. I came across the world to meet someone who shared my faith, who was going to be my partner in life. But you're not that. You're sick." The words hung in the air like an accusation, their weight heavy and final. Chandra had expected many things on this trip. Nervousness, awkwardness, excitement, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. Her mind flashed back to all the conversations they had shared, to all the times Tariq had claimed that love and faith would guide them, that they were destined to meet. But all of that had been built on a foundation of lies. His face fell. The guilt was evident, but there was something more, something darker, more desperate. His eyes darted around the room, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair, clearly struggling with the reality of what had just happened. Chandra's heart pounded in her chest as she took another step back. She wanted to leave. She wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. She had flown 9,000 m to meet him, to give him her trust. And now that trust had been shattered beyond repair. "People need to know what you've been hiding," she said, the words coming out in a whisper, but the conviction behind them unwavering. "You can't just keep living this lie. You can't hurt people like this." The silence between them was suffocating, thick with the weight of his broken promises and her disbelief. She could feel the anger rising within her, but it was overshadowed by the cold realization that there was no fixing. She had made a mistake, one that had cost her not just her time, but her trust. Sandra turned slowly, almost as if her body was fighting against her mind. She wanted to leave the apartment, to walk out the door and never look back. But before she could take another step, Tariq moved quickly toward her, his voice rising in panic. "No, Sandra, please," he begged, his hand reaching out to stop her. "Please don't go. You don't understand. I never wanted this to happen. You have to believe me." His voice was cracking, desperate now, as if he was willing to do anything to stop her from leaving. But Sandra didn't stop. She didn't turn around. The man she thought she had come to know, the man she thought she had trusted, was now a stranger, a man whose actions spoke louder than any words ever could. She could hear the desperation in his voice, but it didn't change the truth. Tariq was not who he had claimed to be, and she would not remain in this place, this lie, any longer. She moved toward the door, her steps steady, even as her heart iced with the loss of what she had hoped for. The truth had been laid bare before her, and now she could no longer deny it. But Tariq wasn't finished. His panic was rising, the air thick with something far more dangerous than she had expected. His voice cracked as he called after her, his words now frantic. "Chandra, please." His hand shot out, grabbing her arm roughly. "You can't just leave. Don't you see? You have no idea what this is doing to me. What you don't understand." But Sandra yanked her arm away, her voice cold. "But let go, Tariq," she said, her words final. "Let me go before you make this worse." There was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation in his eyes before something shifted in his expression. It was as if the mask he had worn, the one that had so carefully crafted their relationship, began to crumble. His desperation turned to something else, something colder. The change in him was immediate and terrifying. The moment of hesitation passed, and before Sandra could react, Tariq moved with alarming speed, pushing her back into the apartment. His grip was strong, violent, and Chandra's heart raced as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a man trying to save face. This wasn't just a man begging for forgiveness. This was a man who was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. As Sandra attempted to make her escape, as she tried to leave the apartment and end the relationship that had promised so much, Tarek's mind snapped. His earlier desperation had shifted into something darker, more intense. As the reality of his situation closed in on him, her refusal to stay, her threat to expose him, his carefully constructed world began to crumble before his eyes. In the chaos of his panic, Tarek made a decision that would seal his fate. He couldn't let her leave. He couldn't let her ruin everything. The fear of being exposed, of having his twisted secret revealed to the world, overwhelmed him entirely. In that moment, he became a man driven by something far more primal than reason or remorse. Tarek's hands, once gentle, now acted with violence. The broken picture frame, an object once used to reflect memories, became a weapon. With one swift motion he struck Sandra across the face. The force of the blow was enough to knock her off balance, sending her crashing into the nearby table. Her body hit the edge with a sickening thud. But before she could regain her footing, he lunged at her. Again, this time with both hands gripping her throat. The world around them seemed to dissolve as Sandra fought, her hands reaching for his wrists, trying desperately to break free. But her strength was no match for his grip tightened, squeezing the life out of her as she struggled to breathe. Each second felt like an eternity. The pain, the terror, the suffocating grip of death closing in on her. It all happened too fast. Her vision blurred. Her body grew weaker. The fight to survive was draining from her as her limbs went limp. Her chest heaving for air she could no longer take. Finally, with one final desperate movement, Sandra's body went still. Her life extinguished by the very man she had come so far to meet. Tarek, breathing heavily, stood over her lifeless form. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with the gravity of what he had just done. He had crossed a line, one that could never be undone. The weight of her body, the finality of her death, settled on him like a suffocating blanket. And for a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the woman he had promised a future, a woman he had killed. But his fear of discovery was not yet over. He wasn't done yet. Tarek quickly dragged her body toward the bathroom, his mind already working on the next step. The bathroom, with its tiles and running water, was the perfect place to hide the evidence. He hoped that by washing away the traces of her death, by submerging her body in water, he could erase the crime he had committed. The illusion of a calm, peaceful ending was all he had left. But even as he moved Sandra's body, his panic didn't subside. His thoughts became erratic as he rushed to cover his tracks. The magnitude of his actions began to sink in, and with it came the frantic need to make sure no one would ever find out what had happened. He took her phone, her lifeline, to the outside world and began deleting every single message they had exchanged. The text, the videos, the plans they had made, it all had to be erased. If he could eliminate the proof, the world would never know. Tarek wasn't done yet. His frantic mind raced to the next logical step, making it seem like Chandra had simply left. As he wiped the phone clean, he began to book her return flight, trying to convince himself that this was the best course of action, that no one would be able to trace her disappearance back to him. He had to act quickly, hide everything he had done, and go on with his life as if nothing had changed. But the walls were closing in. His efforts to cover his tracks would soon unravel, and it wasn't long before things began to fall apart. In the chaos of his actions, Tarek missed something crucial: Sandra's passport. In the confusion of trying to conceal his crime, he had overlooked the one thing that would make everything come crashing down. The passport, still sitting on the table where she had placed it earlier, was his undoing. As the authorities began to piece together the facts of Sandra's disappearance, Tarek's calm facade started to crack. What began as a series of desperate actions to cover up the truth now seemed like a parade of red flags for anyone paying close attention. The picture he had tried so carefully to paint, of a woman leaving abruptly, of a life untouched by violence, was beginning to unravel with alarming speed. The discovery of Sandra's passport was the first critical mistake Tarek made. It was an oversight that no amount of frantic scrambling could erase. The passport left behind on the table where she had placed it earlier was the key to exposing his lie. Why had she left it behind if she had truly left willingly? The question was simple, but the answer was damning. The police were quick to notice the inconsistencies. Sandra's absence was not the result of a spontaneous departure. Something had gone wrong, and as they arrived at the apartment, their suspicion grew stronger with each passing moment. Tarek's attempts to cover his tracks became more apparent, and the story he had told began to lose its credibility. The apartment, once a place of tentative hope, now felt like a crime scene. The police began their investigation, slowly walking through the space, cataloging every detail. The smell of the room lingered in the air, stale, heavy with the aftermath of violence. The bloodstains under the carpet were the first physical sign that something was horribly wrong. It was a small but significant clue, one that could not be ignored. Then they found it. The engagement ring. Chandra's engagement ring lying discarded behind the toilet. In any other situation, it might have seemed like an afterthought, a misplaced object in a hurry. But in this case, it was a symbol of trust, of promises made, and now of betrayal and death. The ring had been torn off, most likely during the struggle. Its discovery in such an odd place was not just a piece of evidence. It was a silent witness to the violence that had taken place in that apartment. The police continued their search, and the more they looked, the more they found. The security cameras outside the building had captured Chandra entering the apartment, but they showed no sign of her leaving. It was another piece of the puzzle that painted a clear picture of what had transpired inside. The apartment had become a trap, a place where Tarek had tried to turn his dark secrets into lies, hoping no one would notice. But now everything was becoming clear. As the forensic investigators arrived, the details became even more chilling. Sandra's autopsy results confirmed what they had feared: strangulation and blunt force trauma. The signs of violence were unmistakable. But it was the other discovery, the one that would forever tie Tarek to his crime, that stunned everyone involved. Tarek's medical condition, something he had hidden so well, was now exposed for all to see. The maggots that had been crawling on his body, on his infected sores, were fresh. In the days leading up to Sandra's arrival, they had been feeding on the decay of his skin. Forensic experts confirmed that the maggots were no more than 48 hours old, a clear sign that his relapse, his contact with infected material, was a recent development. The sores on his body, infected with myiasis, a disease caused by the presence of maggots, were the final proof of his twisted past, a past he had tried to bury but never could. The connection between the physical decay and the violence he had inflicted on Sandra was now undeniable. Tarek had been lying for months, and now the truth was spilling out in ways he could not control. The very thing he had tried to conceal, the dark, twisted compulsion he had once buried in the shadows, was now a central piece of the investigation. His attempt to live a double life, to present himself as a man of faith while hiding the horrors of his past, had collapsed under the weight of the truth. The authorities weren't the only ones uncovering the facts. As Tarek sat in the small interrogation room, his eyes were empty, staring at nothing in particular. The weight of what had happened seemed to finally sink in. He sat slumped in his chair, his hands folded together in his lap, every movement slow and calculated. The once appealing facade, the one he had worn to charm, to manipulate, had vanished. What remained was a man broken by his own actions, his own lies. Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator who had dealt with all kinds of cases, leaned against the wall, watching him closely. Tarek hadn't said much at first, his silence as telling as his broken expression, but it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The fragments of his confession slipping from his lips in between long pauses and fractured thoughts. "I never meant for it to go this far," Tarek began. His voice strained, though the words felt hollow. I just wanted her to see the man I wanted to be, not the man I am." I thought if I could make her believe in me, in us, maybe I could fix myself, maybe I could stop. His words were fragmented, as though even he couldn't completely understand the reality of what he had done. He had been a man of faith. At least that's how he presented himself, a man who preached patience and love, who quoted scripture at every turn, who convinced a woman halfway across the world that he was the one. But in truth, his soul had been torn apart by a darkness he couldn't escape. I was ashamed. Thought I could hide it, that I could bury it. Tariq's voice faltered as he recalled the past. His fingers drummed nervously on the table and his eyes grew distant. The things I did, the things I've always done. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought if I could live like someone else, if I could be the man she thought I was, maybe I could be free. The detectives listened intently, taking note of his every word. It wasn't just a confession. It was the unraveling of the carefully constructed identity that Tariq had worked so hard to maintain. A man of faith, a poet, a lover of God. These were the lies he had crafted. The man who sat before them, however, was nothing more than a prisoner of his own compulsions, unable to break free from the darkness that had consumed him for years. He paused, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his own sickness became clearer. I didn't know how to stop. Thought if I could find someone to love me, someone to forgive me, then maybe I could be saved. But it was never about love. It was always about control, always about something that I couldn't let go of. The room felt heavy with his words. Tariq's admission was chilling, not just because of the crime he committed, but because of the years of silence that had allowed it to fester. His obsession with death, with bodies, had been buried so deep that it became a compulsion, one he couldn't escape, even when it destroyed him. Sandra had been a victim of his need to hide, of his desperate attempt to reshape himself. She had been nothing more than a means to an end, a way for him to feel validated, to feel normal, to pretend he could outrun the twisted urges that had plagued him for years. Tariq's motives were far more complex than simply lying to a woman. They were rooted in a psychological illness that he had tried to keep buried. But the truth had always been there, creeping just below the surface. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He repeated, his eyes glazed over. I didn't want to hurt her. I thought if I could just make her believe in me, then maybe I could escape what I was. But when she tried to leave, when she threatened to expose me, I couldn't handle it. I couldn't let her go. His words hung in the air like an accusation, an admission of guilt, not just for the murder, but for the years of lies that had led up to it. Tariq had spent so much time running from his true self, pretending to be someone he wasn't, that when the truth finally began to emerge, it destroyed him. He had been so consumed by his own self-loathing that he couldn't see the damage he was causing until it was too late. As he spoke, the truth began to shift from something he could justify to something he couldn't ignore. He spoke of his twisted compulsion with a degree of shame. But it wasn't enough. He wasn't just confessing to a crime. He was admitting that his entire existence had been a lie that cost Chandra her life. She had to pay the price, Tariq said, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. I couldn't let her expose me. I couldn't live with the shame, the humiliation. I thought if I could just control her, if I could stop her from leaving, then I could fix everything. But I couldn't. Now, she's gone and I did it. Detective Harris exchanged a glance with her partner. The words were shocking, but they weren't entirely unexpected. Tariq's admission was a revelation of the depth of his sickness, a sickness that had driven him to kill a woman who had trusted him completely. But it wasn't just about the lie. It was about the culmination of years of unchecked obsession, of a twisted mind that had finally snapped under the weight of its own secrets. But the story didn't end there. Tariq's confession was merely the beginning of the unraveling. This wasn't just a case of a man lying about his past. This wasn't simply a crime of passion or a desperate act of fear. This was the result of a darkness festering in silence for far too long. Tariq's obsession, his inability to escape the grip of his twisted desires, had led him to this point. His lies had built a facade that even he couldn't maintain. And Chandra had become the final victim of a mind consumed by its own demons. Sandra had to pay the price for my sickness, Tarek said, his voice barely audible now. And I couldn't stop myself. But as he finished speaking, a final damning piece of the puzzle fell into place. The detectives had found something in the apartment, something Tarek had overlooked in his panic. Was a simple yet telling detail that tied him even more tightly to his crime. Video. A video that Tarek had filmed the night before, unknowingly sealing his fate. The final act had played out, and the truth was no longer something he could escape. His confession had brought him face to face with his own self-destruction, but the full extent of his actions was only just beginning to surface. Tarek's attempt to hide behind his lies had failed. The darkness he had tried so desperately to bury was now exposed for the world to see, and there would be no turning back from the consequences of his actions. Back in Georgia, Sandra's family was still trying to comprehend what had happened. The woman they knew, the mother, sister, and friend who had spent so many years nurturing her family, had been taken from them in the most tragic and senseless way. The grief hit them like a wave, crashing over them in the days that followed her death. They couldn't fathom that the woman who had always been so strong, so careful with her heart, had been so violently ripped away from them. Her sister Tasha sat in disbelief, unable to accept the harsh reality of what had unfolded. She had been the one closest to Chandra, the one who had shared the ups and downs of life with her. They had been through everything together, and now she was left to mourn the loss of her best friend, her confidant, her family. The funeral was a somber affair, a gathering of family and friends who had come to pay their respects, to say goodbye to a woman who had given so much of herself to others. The church was filled with quiet sobs, whispered prayers, and the gentle hum of mourners reflecting on the life Sandra had led. Her family, still in shock, could barely comprehend the weight of her absence. As the pastor stepped up to the pulpit, the room fell silent. He began reading from the psalm Sandra had always cherished, the words meant to bring comfort, peace, and understanding. But in the midst of the ceremony, as Tasha walked down the aisle to place flowers on her sister's casket, something in the air shifted. A soft voice, barely audible, whispered from behind her. "He told me the same thing, that sex before marriage was sin." Tasha froze in her tracks. The word struck her like a bolt of lightning, and she turned to find the source. There, standing in the back of the church, was someone she didn't recognize. The stranger's face was familiar in a way that sent chills down her spine. She couldn't place the voice, but she knew what it meant. The whisper spoke of a shared pain, a shared deception. Tasha's heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced to piece together the fragments of a story she hadn't yet heard. Was this another woman? Another victim of the man her sister had trusted? The realization began to settle in, and it felt like a weight she couldn't lift. The funeral, a place for mourning, now felt like the beginning of a much darker truth. In the days that followed, Tasha began to investigate, to piece together the details of her sister's last moments. The more she uncovered, the more she learned about Tarek and the web of lies he had spun. It was clear that her sister hadn't just been a victim of violence. She had been manipulated, deceived by a man who had built an entire identity based on false promises and twisted beliefs. And just like Sandra, the women before her had been swept into his lies, believing in the sincerity he pretended to offer. Kindly subscribe. Story by Sena. Like and comment your thought on a distance relationship. Thank you. As Tasha dug deeper into Tarek's past, she found more disturbing truths. Women just like her sister who had been drawn into his world, only to find out too late that the man they had loved was not who he appeared to be. The more she learned, the more she realized that this wasn't just about a single woman's tragic death. This was about a pattern of deceit that stretched far beyond Chandra, far beyond the promises of love and faith Tarek had given. The woman's words echoed in Tasha's mind. "He told me the same thing, that sex before marriage was sin." It became clear that Tarek had been using his supposed faith as a tool to manipulate women, to create an illusion of morality, a mask that hid his true intentions. On August 11, 2024, after a lengthy and emotional trial, Tarek Lewis was sentenced for the brutal murder of Sandra Williams. The courtroom was packed, filled with family, friends, and reporters who had followed the case closely since Sandra's tragic death. For the Williams family, the day felt like both a final chapter and an agonizing continuation of their grief. While they had fought for justice for Chandra, nothing could bring her back. Tarek's actions were beyond comprehension, and the sentence was a reflection of the horror he had inflicted. The judge's voice was firm as he pronounced the verdict: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent as the gravity of the decision settled in. Tarek, who had once presented himself as a man of faith, now stood as a convicted murderer, facing the consequences of his carefully hidden darkness. Sandra's family, though devastated, felt a small sense of justice. The lie had been exposed, and Tarek would no longer be able to harm anyone else. But the damage he had caused, both to Chandra's life and the lives of those who loved her, was irreversible. The sentence was a marker of the end of the trial, but the healing for Sandra's family had only just begun. The judge's words echoed through the room as Tarek was led away in handcuffs, his face expressionless. He had spent months building a facade, convincing Sandra and others that he was a man deserving of love and trust. But in the end, the truth had shattered everything. Now he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to escape the reality of his actions. As the authorities prepared to escort him out of the courtroom, the Williams family held on to the bittersweet feeling of closure. They had fought for justice for Sandra's memory, and now they would carry on her legacy in the best way they knew how, by never forgetting the love, strength, and joy she had brought to their lives. Tarek's sentence was not just a personal consequence for him. It was a reminder of the fragility of trust and the destructive power of lies. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always comes to the surface, and it had cost Tarek everything. Sandra's story is a reminder of the dangers of misplaced trust, of the way hope can cloud our judgment. When we are yearning for something so deeply, something like love, we sometimes fail to see the warning signs because we don't want to. When we are yearning for something so deeply, something like love, we sometimes fail to see the warning signs because we don't want to. We want to believe in the good, in the possibility of redemption, and we tell ourselves that the person we're trusting is just like us. But when the truth finally breaks through, it often comes with consequences too devastating to bear. But the truth was, Sandra's death wasn't just a tragic mistake. It was the result of a man who had long since given up on redemption. Someone who had buried his own darkness so deep that it eventually consumed him, and in the end cost Sandra her life. Tarek had spent his life pretending to be something he was not, hiding behind a facade of faith and respect, using his charm to draw women in. But his lies were exposed for what they were, a means of control, of manipulation built on years of repressed compulsion. As the case closed, the sentence was delivered and Tarek was locked away behind bars where he would serve life without the possibility of parole. His deception was over, but the damage he had caused, Sandra's death, the broken hearts left behind, could never be undone. Sandra Willis may never have had the chance to live the life she had dreamed of, but her story served as a warning to others. Her death, though tragic, sparked a conversation about the dangers of online relationships and the dark side of deception. Her family continued to speak for her, telling her story and sharing the lessons learned from her loss. Have you ever trusted someone completely? What would you do if you found out the person you loved had kept a secret like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you have walked away, or would you have paid the price like Sandra? As you reflect on Sandra's story, ask yourself, what would you do if you found out the person you trusted most wasn't who they claimed to be? The truth can be difficult to face, but it's something we must all confront in order to protect ourselves and others from the lies that can tear lives apart. Kindly subscribe. Story by Sena. Like and comment your thoughts.